السلام عليكم أيها السيدات والسادة. Shalom, حافرين بحافرات. Peace be upon you, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Samir Bitar. I have the honor and privilege to serve as chair and moderator for this morning panel. I would like to start by thanking all of you for being with us and for your support. Before we begin, this presentation is part of the 13th Annual International Conference on Central and Southwest Asia. I would like to thank the Central and Southwest Asian Studies Center, especially all my colleagues and staff, the Montana World Affairs Council, the UM Department of History, the Department of Modern and Classical Languages and Literatures, the Russian Studies Program. I would also like to extend thanks to the President's Office and Office of the Provost at the University of Montana, as well as the Rocky Mountain Ballet Theater for sponsoring and organizing this conference. Of course, a special thanks goes to the members of the Greater Mozilla community, as well as the faculty, students, and staff at the University of Montana, who have supported the organizers of this conference with their deep commitment to bringing discussion and important and critical international issues to this campus and community. Today we have a distinguished speaker, Dr. Andrew C. Long. Andrew earned his BA in English and Comparative Literature at Columbia University and his PhD in Comparative Literature from the Graduate Center in New York City. He has taught writing and composition, as well as undergraduate and graduate courses on various topics in literature, cultural studies, in media studies at Hunter College, the American University of Beirut, and at the Claremont Colleges. In addition to his work at KGI, he is currently an adjunct professor in the Department of Cultural Studies at the Claremont Graduate University. On a personal level, I'm very happy to have Andrew with us today. Yesterday, we had the honor of hosting him in Arabic class. And although I just met him, as I listened to him share his experience in Beirut, I felt I know him from a long time ago. Andrew has received research grants from the Hewell Foundation and the Huntington Library. His recent book publication, as I hold it up, is titled Reading Arabia, British Orientalism in the Ages of Mass Publication, 1880 to 1930. He also has written in many peer journals. I will share with you a few titles. From Childhood Memories to the 1960s Politics, recent translations of work by Mahmoud Saeed. Redemption in Jeddah. Fantasy and the Arab-Western Encounter in Text and Image. The Hidden and the Visible in British Orientalism, The Case of Lawrence of Arabia. With no further ado, please help me give our distinguished lecturer, guest, a Montana welcome, please.
No. Can you hear me now? Yeah, okay, good. So when Professor Kia contacted me and asked me to be involved in the conference, towards the end of the conversation he said, well, your panel is just you, and it's an hour and a half. And that really goes against everything I like to do, and certainly in an academic life. I always tell the grad students, really never speak for more than 20 minutes. Make sure you have a good image and a good joke. And here I am. I'm going to be responsible for an hour and a half. And this is pretty daunting, and I'm really concerned that some of you might fall asleep. Please don't. I mean, I think I have something interesting to share with you today. I guess which leads me to my sort of second preliminary comment, which is much of this material is, well, how to put it nicely, Very quick reviews of some novels which you've probably never heard of, you'll probably never think about again, but I think they're important. So sort of bear with me. I do have some pictures to sort of literally illustrate what the novels are about. They'll give you an idea. Yeah, again, I'm concerned that I'll be sort of jabbering and giving you plot reviews for an hour and a half, or at least an hour. So bear with me. Again, I do think that the point that I'm trying to make is important. Also, just in case sort of the idea gets lost over the next hour and a bit, my point's really just this, that in the 1880 period, through the 1930s at least, I would say as the Lawrence cult starts to sort of ostensibly tail off and Lawrence himself dies, there is intertwined with not just British culture, but I would say British everyday life in the broadest sense, a mass-produced Orientalist fantasy. This fantasy is literary in its basis. It is the word, the written word, the printed word, the mass-produced printed word. And I think it not just is a part of the culture, a part of everyday life of, well, modern 20th century Britain, but importantly, it serves what I call a sort of, to borrow, it's an unfortunate word from Slavoj Žižek, but it's a kind of a prophylactic, it's a sealing or even a masking function with regard to, shall we say, some of the contradictions, the ideological contradictions which underpin Britain and the British Empire in the period. I'll try to elaborate this perhaps with a very short clip from The Sheikh, starring Rudolph Valentino. Some of you have probably seen this. Maybe at that point will be a little bit clearer. Now, this idea, this again, and this prophylactic function, as I called it, I think really holds sway until about the 1980s. And it's in the 1980s that I think that the pressures of immigration, as well as the change of politics, the collapse of the, not the collapse, but the erosion of the appeal and the organizational function of the old British left changes things. And there are a number of books, which I'll get to in the second part of the talk, which I think are exemplary in sort of pointing to the, again, the collapse of the prophylactic function, but what replaces it. And I call this a kind of a taking the fantasy for reality. So if at first the fantasy functioned in this sort of masking or prophylactic way, in the second instance, after the 1880s, the problem is some of these writers who we know. I mean, you've all heard of Salman Rushdie, for example, Martin Amis, Ian McEwan. I mean, some of these are great writers. I quite like Ian McEwan's work. But I'll try to elaborate, but I think that they shall we say, take the Orientalist fantasy for reality. And one of their crew, you also probably know, Christopher Hitchens, really went, before his passing away, really went overboard with a campaign against what he called Islamofascism. So this paper is about Islam and the place of Orientalism in British life to this very moment. And I do think that given the global economy, given new media, that these ideas are not just a British issue, but very much an American issue, as we certainly know from the news this morning. Okay. Title of my talk today, Tales of Saladin, is easily explained. In the 19th century, there was a good deal of interest in the Crusades, as some of you might know from reading Walter Scott's novels such as Ivanhoe and The Talisman. Does anybody read Walter Scott anymore? I don't know. I did as a kid. But in particular, a cult developed around two figures, Richard Coeur de Lion, or King Richard I, the Lion-Hearted, and his Middle Eastern, albeit Kurdish, counterpart, Saladin, or his full name was Saladin ibn Yusuf Ayyub. I think this was a cult and a pairing of characters which survived well and would still make for a good populist film about the Crusades for a Western audience, of course. Though there actually is a Saladin Arab film. He's still a cult figure. On the other hand, at the end of the 20th century, we have another Saladin, specifically Saladin Shamsha, or Saladin the Toady. That is the meaning of his name in Urdu, one of the two protagonists of Salman Rushdie's most controversial novel, The Satanic Verses. My objectives today are also easily explained, as I want to trace, albeit roughly, the representation of Islam, specifically Muslims in the Arab world, in British literature from the late 19th through the 20th century. I'll focus on examples from the 1880 to 1930 period, and then from our own time, that is, at least from the 1988 publication of the Satanic Verses to the Charlie Hebdo murders, bringing us up to date. I have some reason for this emphasis in periodization, which fits with my other points. Now, anyone with a moderate knowledge of British literature knows that Islam and sectarian representations of the Prophet are everywhere, in Chaucer, Spenser, through the 18th century. You really can't teach British literature without some sort of anti-Islamic slur, alas. However, I argue that it's with the 19th century, for the most part, the literary engagement with Islam is rooted in the specifics of colonial struggles, particularly in the Sudan, and is not then again about Islam as such in the older sectarian tradition. So it's this tradition, which I'll outline here with reference to the Sudan War, that's the Anglo-Egyptian Sudan War, desert romances, which spun out of that, and also the rise of British Islam, and offer examples from the last 2 decades then of the 20th century as a break and counterpoint which informs where we are today. Also, an important point here, it's literature, mass-produced Orientalist literature, is a feature of modern British and American and European culture, and the related fantasy of the Orient is a constitutive fantasy. Now, in the introduction to Alain Gros-Richard's monumental book, The Sultan's Court, Inladen Dolar offers the most pithy definition of fantasy as understood in psychoanalysis and with reference to the fantasy of the Oriental despot. First, this fantasy, as Gros-Richard argues, is widespread in the West and is the kernel of much Enlightenment thought, particularly that of Montesquieu. Still, what interests both the commentator and writer is the enjoyment factor. The Sultan in question is certainly a figure of arbitrary power, but most of all, a despot of enjoyment who consumes and even wastes an endless flow of desirables, whether women, food, art, or his domains. The Sultan of the Enlightenment has much in common, as we obviously see, with early European medieval sectarian representations of the Prophet. The flow is one way, for he is strictly obeyed by his subjects. Right? Think of the recent book, the French novel Submission, our sort of fascination with this idea. We'll hear more about submission later on, I think, this afternoon. For he's strictly obeyed by his subjects, who cannot enjoy, since he is the one supposed to enjoy. Yet there's something that exceeds a simple economy of destruction here, which Dolar and Gros-Richard, following Lacan, call an economy of surplus enjoyment. That is, the subjects who cannot enjoy, nonetheless enjoy in another way, a surplus enjoyment that accrues only to the Sultan or the Prophet, as we see in our sectarian representations. The enjoyment of despotic subjection is grounded in belief, and is a key feature of the fantasy, for we need to believe in their belief, as Gros-Richard recounts in his readings of Western attacks on the character of the Prophet Muhammad and his followers, Muslims. Moreover, in this sense, and following the fantasy, Oriental despotism is not a system of brute force after all, but in the terms of the fantasy, it's all about sexuality and obedience. If fantasy, according to Dolar and Gros-Richard, is all about desire then, and the surplus of enjoyment, it also serves as a masking function for something else, which cannot find form in the conscious or unconscious mind. The fantasy is a protective veil which mediates enjoyment and keeps us from the edge of this abyss and an annihilating fall into jouissance. Today, we have ripped aside this protective veil and taken the fantasy for reality. This next section I've titled The Khartoum Nightmare. I'll tell you more about this fellow. This is General Charles Gordon, the commander of Khartoum when it was overrun by the Mahdist army in 1885. It is especially with the struggle, especially with the Anglo-Egyptian War in the Sudan of the late 19th century, that we find all of the above, as it coincided and was also instrumental in the emergence of a kind of mass culture-based Orientalism and representations of Islam, which came to play a decisive role in 20th century British and Western society, politics, and everyday life in both formal and informal ways. A massive burst of popular literature accompanied and followed the British War in the Sudan and continued unabated even when the war concluded 14 years later when Kitchener's forces destroyed the Mahdi army and regime at the Battle of Omdurman. By the way, a very, very short battle. They were using machine guns and they spent 14 years building up to it and annihilated the Mahdi army within hours, if I remember correctly. To that end, I'll trace this movement with reference to two novels in particular, Arthur Conan Doyle, Sherlock Holmes guy, The Tragedy of the Korosko, and A.E.W. Mason's often filmed but seldom read Four Feathers. The Mahdi emerged in the early 1880s and quickly gained a following of the devout and the disaffected, as many were angry with the Anglo-Egyptian taxes and the ban on the slave trade. This is in the Sudan, which was then under the rule of the Egyptian Khedive. That was the government which was appointed and approved by jointly by both the British Empire and what was left of the Ottoman Empire. By 1884, the Mahdi army was large and growing, especially after the annihilation of the British Egyptian troops under Hicks Pasha. In early 1884, Gordon was sent to Khartoum to arrange the evacuation of Europeans, but once there, he changed his mind, thinking he could beat a siege by the Mahdi army. He was an engineer by training. By February of 1885, Khartoum had fallen and Gordon was dead, famously speared and beheaded on the steps of the palace in Khartoum. Gladstone, the PM at the time, did not respond immediately. He had no love for Gordon anyway, but appointed General Kitchener to take measures to defeat the Mahdi. The latter carefully built a railroad and supply system, and nearly 14 years later, at the Battle of Omdurman, decisively destroyed the Mahdi's army, leadership, and the caliphate. In order to understand the rise of the later popular literature and novels of the 1890s, we have to look back to the pre-war and even wartime coverage in some of the newspapers at the time, particularly the Illustrated London News and the Pall Mall Gazette, which actually popped up right in this period. The root of these novels that I'm going to talk about is in this early reportage, and it's what I call the condition of literary possibility. Starting with Hicks Pasha's defeat and extending through 1885, one newsweekly, Pall Mall Gazette, or I'll call it the PMG here, also provided expert information, which included, say, on June 3rd, 1884, background essays on the Mahdi and his origins, on Mahdism, Islam, and the Sudan. Mahdism, as most of you might know, is an Islamic belief in a prophesied redeemer, Muhammad Ahmed, in this instance, a leader of the Samaniya order. He proclaimed himself the Mahdi in June 1881. His insurrectionist movement was called the Mahdiya. PMG published British expert opinion as well as writers from the region, including both Egypt and the Sudan, as well as battle diagrams showing the movement and the formation of troops in both camps, and in one instance, a drawing of a captured Mahdi flag, including a translation of the Arabic inscription. Very, very ironic, or, well, it certainly resonates today, given all the images we've seen of the ISIS flag, right? That black flag with the Islamic script on it. I'll show you a picture of the drawing in a second, well, in a few minutes. Yet with the fall of Khartoum and Gordon's gory death, again, he was speared and his head publicly displayed, all of the print news venues offered up to the day, and even our coverage, with screaming headlines stoking the fear and outrage of the British public. After Gordon's death, literary production shifted with a spat of books about the conflict, mostly about Gordon and the Mahdi, as well as various captivity narratives. I mean, again, all of which we have today. The decisive phase of the literary production of the Sudan campaign lies with novels, as I noted above. The two novels in hand are notable because of the celebrity author in the case of tragedy, that is, most people knew Arthur Conan Doyle very well, and for the film history of Four Feathers. Yet there were other immensely popular, in all senses of the word, novels about the Sudan, such as boys' novels like Dash for Khartoum and With Kitchener in the Sudan, by the late 19th century author and tycoon of boys' literature, G.A. Henty. Again, they probably don't teach him in the English department here. He's a popular writer and forgotten, interesting in a historical, ideological sense. And so we move now from boys' novels to adult adventure fiction, The Tragedy of the Korosko by Arthur Conan Doyle, and then to the novel of Orientalist romance, Four Feathers, and then on to desert romances as an acknowledged genre. Like Henty, Conan Doyle was a successful, popular writer. And also like Henty, he followed his own successful formula with the Sherlock Holmes stories. The story turns on opposing scenes, that is, on the tragedy of the Korosko. That is, the deck of the tourist steamer, the Korosko. It's set up for tea with elegant furniture and china, in contrast to the harsh heat and topography of the desert. It's a group of British some European, and I think one American tourists, and they're steaming down the Nile. They're doing the Nile tour, or up the Nile, actually, right? They're on the deck having their tea, and meanwhile there's a war going on around them. I mean, you get the point, right? Yet, the tragedy of the Korosko is a little more than a cliffhanger in an adventure story set in the Sudan, where Doyle deployed all of the elements introduced in the press coverage of the Sudan campaign in the early 1880s and in popular literature thereafter. Again, to the extent, and for lack of a better way of expressing this point, the tragedy of the Korosko is structured almost like a porn narrative, for the plot is simply a familiar, well-worn frame upon which scenes are threaded. The characters are not developed in any depth, nor with any complexity or interest as required for the players in popular stories. Indeed, there's no complexity of any sort in this novel, only a stereotype and well-trodden narrative ground. Consider, for example, there's a spinster auntie from Boston. Her name is Miss Adams, who, of course, is constantly concerned with cleanliness and complains about the dirty little Sudanese and their flies, and tries even at one point to clean a villager's house. And then there's the Frenchman, who is whiny, duplicitous, Michel, arrogant, and disagrees with the British foreign policy. When the group is initially surrounded by the Mahdists, he shouts, "Vive le Califat, vive le Mahdi." Fardet, that's his name, his antagonist is Colonel Cochrane, who plays the British retired officer you've probably seen many times in TV and the BBC, recently retired from the British Army, and he's similarly a known type. He is, it seems, the mouthpiece for Conan Doyle. Cochrane, one of the Americans, who's a very practical man, of course, is eventually killed by the Mahdists, but they agree, however, that it is the, quote, unpleasant duty of the English-speaking nations to take care of the sick nations. And we might think recently of Greece and Spain, but in this instance it's Egypt and the Sudan. As the American declares, each has his own mission, but then the East never changes, as Cochrane makes clear. We should not forget that these are tourists on a package tour, the sort we now take for granted as part of middle-class life. Cooks started such tours to Egypt and the Near East in the 1860s. Moreover, they follow a Baedeker's guide to the region. And they are, for the most part, interested in the ancient sites, not the present people. The contemporary Sudanese kind of get in the way, right? While touring one site, Abu Sir, they are attacked by the Mahdists, and as the coverage would have it, the latter appear as they should. They wear the patchwork tunic of the movement, the jibba, a sign of Muslim piety and commitment, and they're armed with spears and guns. They're a mix of Arabs and black Africans, known in the text as Negroes, and their leader is a tall and thin, and he sports a long beard and has a piercing gaze. I'll give you a picture of, I don't think there were ever any photographs of the Sudanese Mahdi, but there were a lot of ideas of what he should appear, and I have a drawing which I'll show you. Years later, and probably working with the same popular sources, Lytton Strachey described Muhammad Ahmed, the illiterate preacher from the Nile island of Dongola, that's the Sudanese Mahdi, as a tall, dark Sudanese man with a long black beard, big eyes, and a piercing gaze, literally the word he used. Of course, like Gordon before them, the tourists are offered a deal where they can convert to Islam or die. They stall the process by debating with an elderly and befuddled imam. The tourists are eventually freed by the combination of bribes to former Egyptian soldiers in the Mahdist group and an attack by the Egyptian Camel Corps, called actually the Gyppies. As the Mahdists are surrounded and shot by the British forces, they dismount from their camels, stand on their prayer rugs, and prepare to die, information which Colonel Cochrane relates to the women in the group, and obviously derived from these same early 1880s press reports from the battlefield. By the end of the Sudan campaign, Kitchener had demonstrated the deadly and grotesque capabilities of modern warfare, particularly the machine gun, where Maxim guns replaced the Gatling, wiping out the Caliphate's fighters in a matter of hours. Thousands of dead littered the battlefield of Omdurman. A contemporary photograph shows the leadership of the Caliphate lying dead on the ground, riddled with British bullets. Though effective warfare, this was clearly not the sort of victory image to be vaunted, for it really looked like the revenge scene so longed for after all those years, bloody and swift. To the contrary, with the next novel, Four Feathers, written in 1902, we see the way the Sudan campaign was supposed to be remembered. Again, the actual gore of the battlefield wasn't really the way Britons wanted to think about it. They wanted to think about the martyrdom of Gordon and the loss, but then it turned in quickly to something else. They weren't really actually interested in the nastiness of the scene of battle at Omdurman. They wanted desert romance, and we're starting to get this with Four Feathers. In fact, Four Feathers is really a love story, a kind of colonialist melodrama. The story concerns Harry Feversham's apparent betrayal of his friends. They went to war and he didn't. When the story starts, he's at a ball with friends when word arrives that the regiment is to be called up for the relief of Gordon. Harry, due to marry Ethne, a very interesting name, given this is all about race, right? And I think it's also, she's Irish, if I remember correctly, which is also quite interesting. Had already resigned his post, but does not tell his comrades. When they find out, they send him 3 feathers, which he receives in Ethne's presence. She asks him if he did if he did this as an act out of cowardice and not for her. Harry is so honorable that he takes on the stigma of dishonor, cowardice, rather than to have Ethne think that he did this for her, for love, that is to stay and marry and be with her. She then hands him a 4th feather from her hat. The story centers around Harry's disappearance from society and then the country as he attempts to return the feathers to his comrades in the Sudan. That is, if you're given one, you have to do something heroic and return it, right? Even as his best friend Jack returns from the war blinded and is in turn intent on courting Ethne, the story starts then notably with young Harry listening to his father with his stories about the Crimean War, where British soldiers charged the Russian trenches in a very different kind of warfare. And it's one of his father's friends, Such, who extends himself to help Harry through the struggle despite the stigma he bears. So first, this is a novel then about love lost and regained, as Harry eventually returns and Jack cedes his place in Ethne's life. Four Feathers was adapted as a film 4 times, but it's not really as a novel about the nitty-gritty of the Sudan campaign. There is, through a recount by one of his characters, I think it's actually by Jack. Jack was imprisoned in the famous Mahdist prison in Omdurman. And there's a few pages about his experience in the prison, how awful it was. But actually, there are very few scenes that, in the novel at least, take place in the Sudan. Now, don't think that filmmakers missed a chance. Of course, there are lots of scenes in the Sudan, or what would be the Sudan, in the films. And I think that's very telling. In fact, actually, most of the actual novel takes place in the drawing rooms of British society, and also in Ireland. This leads us, however, to the emergence of, I think, a very important genre that's still with us. And I think actually, I know, it's at the root of the appeal of, well, you can laugh if you want, 50 Shades of Grey. And that is the desert romance. In the early 20th century, we see the violence of adventure stories and news reports about the war in the Sudan morph into related romance narratives, and then to desert romance as a genre. Now, this genre has roots in the infamous porn novel, The Lustful Turk, which I believe was first published in the 18th century and has been in continuous publication since then. It's replete with stories of captive white Christian women, a dark and handsome Bey who's also a murderer and a rapist. But here we see these features mapped onto acceptable storylines, that is, in the desert romance. To begin to demonstrate this point, we have to only consider a novel and play that entail more about the prophet and less about the lusty sheikh. That is, Hall Caine's long-forgotten The White Prophet. It really was a popular novel that I'm sure very few people have read it. But it's actually, I didn't just dig this up as a matter of literary archaeology or something. You know, it's very, I think, relevant to the argument here. Apart from his brief foray into melodrama set in the Near East, and in this case Egypt, Hall Caine was otherwise a very successful novelist, best known for his novel The Manxman and other bestsellers, and for his performance as a late Victorian and Edwardian literary personality. The novel itself, The White Prophet, is a melodrama about the rise of a new imam, more Mahdis, right, amongst the poor of Egypt, a man who, while educated at Al-Azhar University, the Islamic Center of Islamic Learning in Cairo, is very much a man of the people and Egyptian nationalist. And his name is Ismail Amir. and the populace proclaims him a new Mahdi, which in 1909 was certainly a tough topic for the British public. Indeed, the analogy with first the Mahdi Ahmed of the Sudan, the historic figure, and then with Jesus Christ, no less, is obvious and rather strained. Ishmael's father, of course, was a Libyan carpenter and a boat builder who moved to Khartoum. Ishmael's earliest memories are of a white pasha pacing, that will be Gordon, pacing the roof of the consular palace looking for relief boats which never arrived. Again, for a British readership of the early 20th century, this is an obvious, if not contrived, reference to the siege of Khartoum and the eventual death of General Gordon and the massacre of the Khartoum populace. Only slightly less obvious, while imprisoned for sedition, Ishmael is forced to marry a Coptic Christian woman at Enso, which he instead embraced, loving this woman as his wife and inspiration, and suggesting then the relationship between Jesus and Mary Magdalene. The parallel narrative follows the rise of one Charles Gordon Lord, the son of the Governor General, Lord Newnham, and a rising star in the British Army in Egypt. When the novel opens, we learn that he has had a long-standing love affair with Helen Graves, the daughter of his commanding officer, General Graves. This Gordon, rather like the Orientalist heroes of the 19th century, grew up in Egypt, nursed by an Egyptian woman, Fatima, the mother of his closest friend and fellow soldier. Gordon also speaks Arabic and does not hide his love for the Arab world in contrast to his lover and her father. At one point, echoing her father's sentiments, Helen proclaims that the British Army must smash the Mahdi, which is a line directly lifted from W.T. Stead's interview with Gordon in the Pall Mall Gazette. He said as he stepped onto a boat, it was literally a last-minute interview, "I'm going to Khartoum and I will smash the Mahdi." It's not surprising that Gordon defies his superior and argues with him about his plan to attack this new Mahdi's camp, angering the older man so that he assaulted Gordon and in the process fell to the ground and suffered a fatal heart attack. The death, however, is blamed on Ishmael, who had visited the general earlier in the day, and Helen, believing this man killed her father, goes to his camp disguised as an Indian Muslim princess. She speaks Arabic and is familiar with Islamic tradition. Ishmael falls in love with her and marries her as his Rani, though vowing it would never be a carnal marriage. As she plots to kill Ishmael, Gordon is also in disguise in the camp. You get the point, right? Determined to help Amir succeed given his support for his liberal and populist brand of Islamic nationalism. The story comes to a head when the Mahdi Ishmael and his people march on Cairo in a nonviolent tax protest and a general demonstration against British rule, again suggesting Jesus and Roman rule. He's greeted in the streets, riding astride a donkey, and a military attack and disaster is only narrowly averted. In the end, Ishmael divorces Helen to help Gordon, and the latter is reinstated in the army and promoted. This particular desert romance has obvious roots in the Gordon story. We're starting to see a bit of a change, however, with Edith Hull's The Sheikh, which is, I would say, the most representative and best known example of Orientalism in British, American, and mass culture, and the best example of this shift. Unlike her male predecessors of the 19th century, Hull, which was a pseudonym for Edith Maud Winstanley, was not of the aristocracy, nor from a wealthy family. Rather, she was actually a fairly ordinary housewife of an English farmer who actually went off to war, the First World War. She wrote the novel during the war. Indeed, Hull did not even visit North Africa. The Sheikh is set in Biskra, an infamous tourist destination in Algeria, the former colonized Algeria, nor the Middle East, until she and her family were able to do so with the earnings from the hugely popular novel. And the novel was popular from the moment she published it in Britain in 1919 and the United States in 1921. As critic Susan Blake notes, quote, "It was the first novel to appear on the bestseller list 2 years in a row. By 1965, it had sold nearly 1.2 million hardback copies. In the United States, it ran through 50 printings in 1921 alone. The story remains familiar today, even for those who've never read the novel or seen the film, which fixed the place of Rudolph Valentino in Hollywood legend. The plot is about abduction and captivity, rape and humiliation, race, the word at the time would have been miscegenation, and religion, Islam, love, and class. It is a mix of plot elements that might be found in part in other texts, but it's distinctly Orientalist as a whole group of collected features." Again, I have a clip to share with you and discuss in a minute. Now, the counterpart to this mass-produced British Orientalist tradition is that there's a very popular writer at the same time who gives up his career as a novelist and turns to Islam. His name is Marmaduke Pickthall, and for me, he's really probably one of the most interesting figures among British writers of the late 19th, early 20th century, a period punctuated by the Great War and in literature by the rise of what we know as the modernist movement. Marmaduke Pickthall published reviews and serialized versions of his works during the fin de siècle period in very, very prominent journals such as the Cornhill Magazine, 19th Century, which became 20th Century, obviously, Academy, and Athenaeum. You maybe heard of a couple of these. All of these journals were either mainstays or held a prominent place as respected journals directed towards an educated middle and upper middle class readership. Pickthall was one of 12 children born to Mary and Reverend Charles Pickthall, though the family had social standing given his father's position in the church. His father died in 1881, and the family experienced great financial hardship. Still, Marmaduke attended Harrow as a day student. You know Harrow is one of the public schools of Britain, while his fellow students included Winston Churchill and L.S. Amory. Following his failure to gain a position in the Levant consular service as a young adult, and at the invitation of a family acquaintance, Pickthall visited Syria for an extended stay from 1894 to 1896. Syria then included modern Lebanon at the time, as well as Mandate Palestine. And a young Marmaduke traveled the countryside and also spent time in the major cities of the region, Beirut, Quds, or Jerusalem, and Shem, Damascus. He spent a good deal of time traveling off the usual tourist routes while making friends and contacts among the local population wherever he went. Indeed, Pickthall learned Arabic and much about the culture of the region to the outrage of his fellow countrymen, and even went so far as to shun the company of fellow Britons, Europeans, and Christians. This was the formative experience of his life, launching him as a writer and eventually as a major figure in the Islamic world of the 20th century. Pickthall was a modestly successful writer in the early 20th century, specifically from 1903 to 1922. Most of his novels and short stories from this period concerned the Middle East, and all were published by established houses such as Methuen, Collins, and John Murray, as well as Knopf in the United States. Pickthall was clearly both an accomplished and prolific professional writer. However, perhaps Pickthall is a significant intellectual figure today simply because he converted to Islam in the middle of his adult life, again, resonating with the news of this morning. It quickly gained an important status with first the Muslim community in Britain, and then in the Islamic world as a whole. But today he's unknown, having fallen far out of the canon of early 20th century British literature. Yet to identify him as a British Muslim, as Peter Clarke does in the title of his biography, Marmaduke Pickthall, British Muslim, is not to diminish his work as a writer, but to emphasize that he converted in a time when such a move was still viewed as a scandal. I'd say it's probably still viewed as a scandal. Pickthall actually announced his conversion in 1917. There were early indications of a slow rejection of Christianity in some of his prior work. In 1914, for example, he walked out of a church gathering when the congregation sang For the Mohammedans, the hymn of Charles Wesley, with its racist lines about the Arab thief. As Clarke notes, in the summer of 1917, Pickthall, quote, gave a series of talks to the Muslim Literary Society in Notting Hill, West London, on Islam in Progress. It was during the last of these talks that Pickthall told the audience of his conversion to Islam, explaining that it was only Islam which could be considered as a progressive religion, hence the title of his lecture. Indeed, he underlined his commitment to Islam by taking Muhammad for his first name in lieu of the very English Marmaduke. From this point on, Islam was the center of his spiritual and intellectual life. Again, Clarke's excellent biography provides a detailed account of the writer's conversion and related activism. In these two chapters, Clarke makes interesting comments on the way Pickthall argued for Islam to both Muslims and the West in the shadow of the fall of the Ottoman Empire and the Caliphate, yet in ways which were unique. With regard to political notions of tolerance and the rights of women, and a more general supportive relationship to the sciences and modernity, Pickthall always cast Islam as more Western than the West, or more English than the English in this respect. The circumstances surrounding the book, for which Pickthall is best known today, and which even now is available for purchase worldwide, unlike most of his fiction, are relevant here. I'm referring to Pickthall's well-known translation and commentary, The Meaning of the Glorious Quran. He started the project in 1928 with a series of consultations and meetings with notable figures in Islamic and Arabic literary studies at the Islamic Al-Azhar University, the same one where the fictional Mahdi Ishmael studied. From the start, the project was controversial since it is a translation of a sacred text, Haram, though the sharpest critic of the book, Taha Hussein, was not a religious figure, but rather a professor of Arabic literature at the University of Cairo. Still, what we should take from this controversy and the aftermath is that Pickthall survived the critical storm, and even today, the meaning of the glorious Quran remains a significant text. Look it up. You can get a copy this afternoon. It's more than a mere translation, and around the world. It was first published in 1930 by the now major publishing house, Alfred Knopf of New York City. In his writing about Islam, Pickthall looks to that which most Britons would define as the not British, to propose that Islam is in fact more British or Western than Britain or the West. He goes on to drive this point home by noting that art in the West is alienated from human life and human values, and in this context, an expression of decay in values. Art is valued over human life, and perhaps this explains some recent destruction of historic sites to some extent, this kind of thinking. And this is a valuation which no Muslim or Islamic society would ever propose. Indeed, he pushes further, and as though to answer the tradition of Matthew Arnold, he argues that Islam's emphasis on human life entails political and intellectual tendencies which, while the West espouses them, are in fact contrary to history and fact. In particular, he argues that with Islam there is no opposition to scientific inquiry as there is in Christianity, while the democracy of the West is a sham of the priesthood, unlike the priest-free brotherhood of the Muslim world. Again, we have here a band of brothers. I thought before I get to the second part, I thought we should maybe take a look at some pictures here. This is, you can use the pointer. I think it's, yeah, here it is. This is General Gordon. I actually have this. This is not taken from my version of my copy of the photograph, but it was mass-produced as a carte de visite, about that big. Which probably explains why the quality of this particular reproduction is so bad. I mean, it had been produced so many times. You want to talk about mass production? Here we have the mass production of a martyr. Notice his uniform. His nickname was Chinese Gordon. I don't know if any of you know his story, but he really made his name supporting the royal family of I forgot which particular kingdom it was, but they putting down the Taiping rebellion in China in the 19th century, which was a religious nationalist uprising. And he and I think some French and American officers actually headed the rump army of the kingdom and defeated basically besieged and defeated the Taiping rebels. But so you see some of the details of his uniform here. He also was after that appointed the Khedive in the Sudan in the 1870s. He had a couple of tours in the Sudan. So you see elements which are at once Orientalist in the Far Eastern sense, and then Orientalist in the Middle Eastern or North African or East African sense, incorporated into his uniform. One of your fellow audience members commented that, is this a little bit like Ataturk? And I said no. I mean, the Kemalist image would have been, of the 1920s, would have been very European. A gentleman who, if you go to Turkey, well, at least you used to be able to see these statues I think we have one at home. Ataturk with his cane. I mean, he was a Parisian gentleman. Clearly, Gordon, coming from the empire, was out of his way to add something a little bit different. So hence his look. Most of these adventurers, military figures, Orientalists of the period, usually adopted some kind of a sort of sign of the other into their persona. In fact, there's a good picture, if you want to look it up privately, of him in fact, a Chinese military costume, which was also, I believe, also circulated as a carte de visite. See if I can get to my next set of pictures here. This is taken from the coverage of the Sudan War was not only just news, but they sent out telegraph operators as well as artists and, of course, photographers. And so you basically see it's a multimedia coverage. And a couple of artists went and, from, I guess, life experience, came up with various paintings which were then reproduced, this being one of them, being a representation of a modest cavalry charge. Early on, before the fall of Khartoum, sort of the first wave of British hysteria over the bad news from the Sudan campaign was that the famous British Square had been repeatedly broken by the Mahdists. Because they were very agile, camels and horses, and basically using unorthodox guerrilla hit-and-run tactics, which the British, with their very sort of fixed military ideology, weren't able to cope with. The British Square was repeatedly broken. In the longer version, which you should fear, the longer version of this paper, I had the whole, I should actually read it to you if I don't have it here, the whole long poem by, it's Vitae Lampada. Do any of you know this poem? It's by Sir Henry John Newbolt. It's a very well-known poem, at least it was back in the day. The sand in the desert is sodden red, red with the wreck of the square, that would be the British military square, that broke. The Gatlings jammed and the colonel dead, and the regiments blind with dust and smoke. I need to put the right accent here. The river of death has brimmed its banks, and England's far and honor a name. But the voices of a schoolboy rallies the ranks. Play up, and play the game. You see these lines actually in today in British sports reportage. Play the game, play up, play up. The origins of it actually have to do with the poet's days. I think he was headmaster at Clifton College in Bristol, which is one of the well-known public schools. And the square where they played cricket was, of course, resonating with the broken square of the Sudan. Okay, here's a cover of G.A. Henty's Dash for Khartoum. This is, I wish I could stop this for a second. This is the drawing of the Mahdi that I referred to. There was no life model. I mean, this is just this came out of the imaginary. The piercing eyes, right? This is the poster for one of the versions of the Four Feathers. Folks know the more recent version with Heath Ledger. Back there was a version of the Fall of... Yeah, this was, I forgot the date on this film, but it's at least from the late 50s or early 60s. But notice the cast. Well, you all know who's brandishing the gun, of course, right? The man of the gun lobby. With Laurence Olivier playing the Mahdi. This is Pickthall. Again, he was very enamored of the Turks and wrote some, whatever the idealism of his writing about Western Islam, his writing about Turkey and the Armenian genocide was absolutely inexcusable. He became a kind of an apologist, if not declared so, I think a de facto apologist for the Kemal regime. But you could see the Kemalist look here. He looks, he's not, in any ethnic attire here. He's not declaring his religion. His religion is in his head and in his heart, right? He otherwise looks like a middle class. We could be a doctor. And that brings us to the second part of the talk, which concerns a group of writers, some of whom you may know. This one here you know. I know it's not a great photograph. Salman Rushdie, Martin Amis, and this is his wife, Isabel Fonseca. And back here is Christopher Hitchens. Just so you know what I'm talking about when I get there. This is one of the covers, many covers of Martin Amis's a more recent novel, Lionel Asbo. Do any of you know what an Asbo is? Order, yeah. It's an antisocial behavior order. It's a kind of a, it's a sort of epithet, you know, somebody, you want to say the neighbor's kid is a real loser. He's an Asbo, you know. It's a slur, you know. I'd actually say that the cover of the novel is very much a class slur. A class slur of the British working class. If you could sort of see some of the imagery here. And I don't think actually whoever ever put this together is really far from capturing the spirit of Amis's outlook on, well, contemporary Britain. You know, if he is on the one hand a kind of a racist and certainly anti-Islam, on the other hand there's a sort of a class aspect of his work which I think we should pay attention to. Okay. Okay, let's leave it with that image there. Okay, in 2007, Terry Eagleton, the well-known literary critic, scholar, and rabble-rouser, published, he's a kind of a rabble-rouser, published a short piece in The Guardian where he decried the British writer today. His reasons for making such a statement are worth repeating here, as his comments are both on target and, well, funny in a vicious way. Quote, "The knighting of Salman Rushdie is the establishment's reward for a man who moved from being a remorseless satirist of the West to cheering on his criminal adventures in Iraq and Afghanistan. David Hare caved into the blandishments of Buckingham Palace some years ago, moving from radical to reformist. Christopher Hitchens, who looked set to become the George Well de nos jours, is likely to be remembered as our Evelyn Waugh, having thrown in his lot with Washington's neocons. Martin Amis has written of the need to prevent Muslims traveling and to strip search people who, quote, look like they're from the Middle East or from Pakistan. Deportation, he considers, may be essential further down the road." For Eagleton, these writers are a far cry from their antecedents, who, while mostly writers of the left, were all critics of the savagery of modern Britain. Men, women, modernists, socialists, right-wingers, professors, and scoundrels, none of these earlier generation of writers were ever properly establishment. However, it's with the later wave of post-war writers, notably Philip Larkin and Martin Amis's father, Kingsley Amis, who, by the way, wrote one of the best academic novels you might know, Lucky Jim, that a change was marked. That is through the angry young men period of the 1950s, as these in turn became what Eagleton has dubbed the dyspeptic old buffers. Irish Murdoch and Doris Lessing, despite promise, also turned to the right. Yet as before with Ireland and with the other famous example of Conrad, it was outsiders, non-Britons, who offered hope and renewal. A group which included V.S. Naipaul, Salman Rushdie, W.G. Sebald, and Tom Stoppard. Now, though Eagleton does not tell us much about Naipaul in the quote I just shared, the author's position on immigration, global capitalism, race, and Islam is fairly clear in, say, a novel such as Bend in the River, and in his travelogue Among the Believers. That was, I think, early 1980s. That was about Muslims and what he saw as a rising fundamentalism. As with the novel, Naipaul's observations are sharp and accurate in the travelogue, but it's how he frames these observations and insights and what he finally does with them, all in the context of, well, Enoch Powell, still in a political sense alive, and the continued collapse of the empire and post-colonial immigration, and the slow erosion of a coherent left opposition. That would mark the rise of Thatcher and Thatcherism in Britain. 1981 saw the publication of two books then about Muslim parts of the world. These were, I amend that date here. We'll stay with that. 1981 saw two books that were about the Muslim world, Among the Believers, as I just noted, as well as Salman Rushdie's very good novel, Midnight's Children. The latter novel was Salman Rushdie's first acclaimed novel, and for which he was awarded the 1981 Booker Prize, and is widely considered one of his best, if not his best novel. Midnight's Children combines allegory and autobiography with what we know as magic realism, that is, the fantastic and supernatural presented in realist narrative and prose, as it traces the lives and doings of children born at midnight, somewhere between August 14th and 15th of 1947, when India became independent and partitioned, with the simultaneous birth of the majority Muslim Pakistan. These children have powers, telepathy, and their lives are intertwined with the fates and tragedies of the two new nations. Again, there's a good deal of autobiography here, or at least overlap, as Salman Rushdie was born into an Indian Muslim family in Bombay, Mumbai, on June of 1947. By the way, his name his family changed their name to Rushdie, taking the name from Averroes' family name, Ibn Rushd. It also sounds sort of Anglo. The family stayed in Bombay for a while before moving to Pakistan, though the young Salman was packed off to the rugby school. Again, we're back to these British public schools, and who went to the rugby school and whose father was headmaster of the rugby school, Matthew Arnold. Young Salman went there, however, as a teenager, and he finished before then going on to complete his undergraduate education at Cambridge University. I think Rushdie's education and life experience thereof provides important insight, as first his connection to India-Pakistan was severed, and he spent his formative years amongst young, privileged, and mostly white British children. Moreover, the boarding school experience, while it entails a specific culture, also has a specific literary history. And it's something he's written about. Indeed, the Indian character in Charles Hamilton's Billy Bunter, Greyfriars novels, maybe some of you have read these, that's boys' literature, again, of the early 20th century. There was a character named, and again, you can hear the epithet, Hurry Jamset Ram Singh, an insider at the school, an outsider being that he was literally black by the standards of the boys, their racist standards, yet he was accepted, the insider, because, well, he was a good bowler. We're, again, back to the cricket match on the square. Now, Rushdie has acknowledged this character, but let's consider him again with regard then to the Satanic Verses. Midnight's Children was followed by 1985 Shame, which was a Booker Prize runner-up, and was also based on the subcontinent. And then in 1988, he published the controversial Satanic Verses, which is largely based in post-colonial London. Elwen Dioen. Novels which followed include The Moor's Last Sigh, Fury, Shalimar the Clown, and the recent and Satanic Verses related Joseph Anton, which is more autobiographical. Yet it is the Satanic Verses for which Rushdie is known. Again, the novel was published in September of 1988 and was banned the following October in India for its anti-Islamic content, though in November, Rushdie was awarded the Whitbread Book Prize in the West for the novel, which was then burned in Bradford the following January of 1989 with demonstrations against the book in Hyde Park. Of course, on February 14th, 1989, Valentine's Day, the Ayatollah Khomeini of Iran issued a fatwa against Rushdie and Viking Penguin, a death threat. On February 18th, Rushdie apologized to no avail, publicly apologized to no avail, and riots followed in the same month in Bombay with demonstrations in New York and Berkeley. In March 1989, the Nobel Prize Committee was split over consideration of the novel, and Britain broke off diplomatic relations with Iran. Though the Islamic Conference Organization refused to support the Ayatollah's fatwa, demonstrations continued around the world, with 50,000 gathering to protest in London. By June 4th, the Ayatollah had died, yet the fatwa remained in place as it does today. On August 17th, 1989, Salman Rushdie went into hiding. Now, perhaps many of you know why this novel is still controversial, though a brief summary of the Satanic Verses might help understand the enduring debate and its place here in a talk about Islam and British literature. The novel is comprised of several storylines, with the primary and unifying storyline being the life stories, or rather posthumous stories, of one Jibril Farishta, a Bollywood star when he was alive, known for his portrayals of most deities from most religions. He and Saladin Shamshah, an Indian-born but London-based voice actor, somehow survived a terrorist bombing of their London-bound Air India flight by a bungling group of Sikh terrorists. The novel includes a good deal of backstory about each man, as well as their adventures in the present time of the novel. For both somehow survived, though transformed. The new Shamshah, the toady, has horns, hooves, a tail, a large penis. He's a very devilish character. Well, Farishta is, as always, an angel, the angel Gabriel. As with most of Rushdie's novels, the storyline is determined by the love lives of his characters, that is, his ex-wives, deceased lovers who appear in the sky, old-age pensioner lovers, and so on. There's another narrative in the novel, however, about an Islamic female butterfly-eating mystic named Aisha, who leads an ill-fated pilgrimage to Mecca and into the sea. But it's the sections titled Mahund and the Return to Jahiliyyah where we encounter the source of the controversy. Well, first there is then the imam who eats his people, clearly the Ayatollah himself, which, according to legend, infuriated him. And then there are the dreams of Jibril Farishta that are about a cynical and corrupt man in this town of Jahiliyyah who claims to be a prophet. His name is Mahund, and he has a ragtag following. Mahund, which we know very well, is a Renaissance English epithet against the prophet, while Jahiliyyah, we know, means ignorance. And the terms of his success concern the sacred text of his movement as well. This Mahund initially denounced the gods and goddesses of the city, but then agreed to accept 3 of them as a political deal, and the justification was written into the text as a dream account. Later, he reneged on this deal with the polytheistic powers of the city and accordingly changed the text with a new dream. So if you get it, it's, for a devout Muslim, the blasphemy is piling up, right? And then it goes on. Later, he reneged on the deal. Meanwhile, there was a local brothel called The Curtain where the prostitutes masqueraded as the wives of Mahund the prophet. In his defense, Rushdie and others point out that this is just a dream sequence in the novel. One critic, Sanjay Subramaniam, really comments, I think, interestingly, that why would anybody have read this novel in the first place? It's 600 pages, and it's not an easy read. It involves a lot of in-jokes. There are at least 3 languages in it. But then he also does wonder about the organization of the novel. I'll just try to cut to the chase here. The novel really functions just as Rushdie defends it. It's a novel about post-colonial London, a novel about exile and immigration. But why is this section in there in the first place? It doesn't work. The novel might have been, say, 400 pages and worked very effectively, just as he declared it, as a kind of a follow-up to Midnight's Children and Shame in particular. So I think that's a very sort of apt criticism that we should bear in mind. The second thing is that for the South Asian population of Britain, it's not just, and this will, I think, touches on the Charlie Hebdo sensitivities and debate, but the novel was not just an anti-Islamic smear and blasphemous, but it was a communal smear in a sort of a strange way. The lead characters have absolutely nothing to do with the majority South Asian diaspora population, right? They are not working class. Their lives are very different from the actual lives of, say, working class Britons of South Asian descent in Bradford. Moreover, the characters speak a kind of a schoolboy slang, which is a kind of South Asian schoolboy slang, which is at once insulting, right? At the same time, just sort of far from the reality. Let me quickly get to save some time here, get to Martin Amis. Martin Amis, as you know, is the son of Kingsley Amis and a very well-known writer, London Fields, maybe some of you know. He recently actually moved to Cobble Hill, Brooklyn, which is the epicenter, one of the traditional Arab American communities in Arab American communities in New York City, just a few blocks from Atlantic Avenue. I find that a very interesting irony. Recently, in an interview, well, actually the past couple of years, in an interview in the Daily Mail, he's made some statements, which he's repeated one way or the other, and they're, I think, I'll repeat them very quickly. He said, "I feel very morally superior to Islamists by some distance." He says Islamists, but if you actually follow what he says about Islam, it's fairly clear he means Islam and Muslims. "I feel an intellectual distance to Islam. There are great problems with Islam. The Quran recommends the beating of women." He went on, "Some societies are just more evolved than others," he said. I'm not saying these people are genetically incapable of not being terrorists. I'm just saying some societies are more evolved than others. Young men in these kinds of societies are growing up full of loathing and hatred. Something has to be done about it, and he has a plan. There's a definite urge, don't you have it, to say the Muslim community will have to suffer until it gets its house in order. Not letting them travel, deportation further down the road, curtailing of freedoms, strip-searching people who look like they're from the Middle East or from Pakistan, discriminatory stuff until it hurts the whole community and they start getting tough with their children. He's advocating collective punishment. Now, in fairness, these comments followed the 7/7 attacks in London, and if nothing else, Amos seems to take these terrorist events personally, as we know in the title essay of his 2008 collection, The Second Plane, where he begins with a family member's eyewitness account of the attacks. He talks about the planes flying low over Washington Square, which if any of you have been to New York, that's simply not possible. It's surrounded by the towers of NYU. I mean, it just is a very strange claim. This book of essays is then largely about Islam, or as he equivocates, Islamists. Amos does criticize Bush and Blair and contend their wars. The essay to look for, I think, in the collection, The Second Plane, is The Last Days of Muhammad Atta. But, he's trying to get inside the mindset of Muhammad Atta, one of the organizing figures of the Second Plane attack. But he seems to have little understanding, actually, of who Atta was, meaning where he came from, his communal commitments, what was going on in Egypt at the time. I mean, presumably, maybe his father was in the Brotherhood and, on some kind of a list, imprisoned, etc. He, I think, really shows a sort of little, in some senses, little sort of understanding. I mean, not that I'm not trying to defend any of this, so don't get that idea at all. But another essay also has to do with Sayyid Qutb, one of the considered the fathers of Islamism, and his 1950s adventures in Greeley, Colorado, which you've probably heard about. But that's kind of shooting fish in a barrel as far as I'm concerned. It's, I could tell you more privately about that. But back to Lionel Asbo, we might begin to see some useful connections. This is a 2012 novel, and it has a familiar set of Amos characters, notably the repulsive Lionel Asbo of the title. Lionel Asbo is an uncle, and he takes care of his orphaned nephew. The orphaned nephew does well in school and eventually leaves the little horrible town. Lionel Asbo, meanwhile, being a kind of a career criminal and lumpen proletariat, of course winds up in prison again, but while in prison for his misadventures, he wins the lottery. And of course, the novel is largely about his, shall we say, wasteful ways of spending the money. Now, there's several novels which are actually far more sympathetic to British Islam, notably Monica Ali's Brick Lane. But I actually think Hanif Qureshi's The Black Album of 1985 is the best, I mean, for me. And it's interesting, I could probably find Wikipedia entries from almost everything I mentioned so far, even the dash for Khartoum. But there's no Wikipedia entry for The Black Album, and I think that's interesting. Why? Well, you probably know Hanif Qureshi's work. If not directly, indirectly, you will know maybe Daniel Day-Lewis's film, My Beautiful Laundrette. No? Sammy and Rosie Get Laid, amongst others. London Kills Me. This is Hanif Qureshi. He also wrote a short play, which was a preamble, as we see, to the Black Album, which is titled My Son the Fanatic, and I'll show you a clip from that. This novel, The Black Album, is about a group of young South Asian men at an unnamed university. It's not the University of London. It's clearly one of the second-tier schools. And its central character is Shahid, who is from the suburbs. The others are from the inner city. And it's about the group cohering, and they're all South Asian as a community, and cohering around that experience, and then being in school. But how the rest of the group becomes more Islamized as one of their number, Riaz, begins to push a kind of Sayyid Qutb line. Meanwhile, Shahid is both going along with the group because, well, they're his friends and his community, but at the same time, he's having an affair with his English teacher, the one D.D. Osgood. These are very British characters, who, of course, is very, very PC. The group becomes more and more political. They go to the local council estate to defend a Pakistani family, Pakistani-British family, from being racist attacks. The ante's upped as Riyadh decides that they have to attack the book, meaning the Satanic Verses. They eventually burn the book. There's a big back and forth between Didi, the defender of all PC values in modern Britain, and freedom of the speech and the press, and of course Riaz, who retorts, "You're not letting me speak. You know, what is this hypocrisy of British democracy? You will not let the South Asian man speak." And also to say that this act, this burning Satanic Verses, is in fact an act of free speech. You see here mobilized, again, some of the critiques of the West and the hypocrisy of what they believe to be a colonialist West ideology, namely democracy. Let me sort of end with that, because I would like to show you the clip, at least with Hanif Qureshi, before we take some questions. Yeah, I was going to show you the Sheikh. This clip from the Sheikh is interesting, going back to the first part of the talk, in that the woman lead, a young American woman, out for sort of an adventure on her own with a man who doesn't protect her as he should, I think we're to assume by the novel and the film. She goes to Biskra, which was a kind of a casino town, and winds up going out on a desert trip, and of course is attacked and taken captive by Rudolph Valentino. This clip I was going to show you, look, this is a novel. I have to be straightforward with you. It's about rape. You know, he's the tall, dark, handsome man, but he's violent, sexually violent. I think it's interesting, back to this idea of the shielding, so the prophylactic function, as it were, of the fantasy. What's going on in this period in the early 20th century is the women's movement, right? In some ways, the film is a kind of a working through of women's sexuality and women's power, and it's resolving in its strange ways, or cutting off in other ways the possibility of sort of the threat of castration, I guess. But you can look at that for yourself. It's amazing, though, that the novel and the film actually had a very large female audience. Actually, men didn't like it. They considered Valentino effeminate. And here's a clip from a quick interview with...
It's very traumatic if you're an immigrant, obviously. You would know that. But one of the things that I noticed amongst the young kids who became fundamentalists, I wrote about in this film and also in the Black Album, was that their parents had come to the West, but the kids wanted to remain Muslims because they wanted to identify with their community and with their family. But their rebellion consisted in their being more Muslim than their parents. So I would go to meetings in the mosque, and they'd say, "Oh, my parents, they're really bad. My dad had whiskey last night. You know, my mother didn't say her prayers." And I'd go, "Oh, what do you do? What do you say?" I denounced them. You know, I said to them, "Why aren't you being more Muslim?" and so on and so on. And it was extraordinary, extraordinary procedure. Which, how could you not want to write about that?
Again, we have to.
It's always seemed to me to be an enormous shame that there are certain versions of Islam that do disavow another tradition of Islam, which is, you see,
the Black Album has no Wikipedia entry. I rest my case.
Garden, and particularly in the 1001 Nights. If you actually read the 1001 Nights, it's a filthy read, and it's full of sexual pleasure and you know, all kinds of low and vulgar comedy and humour. And it's a real shame that the Muslim community, as it now is trying to see itself, is disavowing all that. And it'll be very interesting to see when as it were, when the repressed starts to come back, starts to return.
Okay, we'll leave it at that.
Excellent, thank you so much. Very intriguing. We have time for a couple of questions. We have a microphone over there. So if you would be kindly walk to the microphone and ask a question, we would appreciate that.
If you want to go to lunch, that's okay with me.
Hi. I just had a question about after the 1930s and whether the Orientalist tradition continued as it had existed before then, or whether it was kind of beginning the shift towards what you get with Rushdie and Amos and later. But yeah, I was just wondering if the tradition kind of kept with that schoolboy type narratives, or if it significantly changed, say with the Angry Young Men.
Yeah. I think the potential for the change is with the Angry Young Men, but if you think about, you're all familiar with the cult around the film and the figure of Lawrence of Arabia. I'd say that cult does hold sway, yeah, through the 60s and 70s for sure. The potential for change is there. I think it comes to the fore and we get a break. And again, this is just a conjecture. You know, this is just some recent thinking of mine, and I'm happy to be proved wrong. But I think that the break we get in the 1980s was a coming, but it happened in the 1980s for reasons. I would say probably, again, the collapse of the British Labour Party, in Britain at least, the rise of Islamic nationalism on the scene, probably with the collapse of Pan-Arabism, you know, which in the 1970s. There's some historic reasons for that.
Thank you. And if I could just ask you to expand maybe on what you mean by the connection between the collapse of the Labour Party and what that change meant to your mind?
Yeah, that's a long story, but I'd say that the defeat of the Labour Party by Thatcher, the failure of their policies in the 1970s, the terrible economy. I lived as a kid in the 1970s in Britain. I could tell you it was a tough time. Those were days of lead. The Labour Party was largely blamed for it. You think, which of course brought about Thatcher, and then of course the events that happened during the 80s under Thatcher's rule. Further erosion of British Labour's power, namely the breaking of various unions, particularly the miners' strike would probably be one event I'd point to. And then of course the reorganization of labor itself. You know, it became New Labour, and the Blairites pushed out the left-wingers. There were party purges. And you have a new party, which I think is probably going to win the election, this upcoming election, but it's certainly not the Labour of the past. It might be pushed left, as a friend was commenting to me earlier, by the Scottish National Party, but it's a shadow of what it was in terms of its ideology. The other thing to consider, by the way, about this group of writers, they all think they're actually quite leftist. I mean, Rushdie does think of himself as a kind of, probably left of the Labour Party. Martin Amis does, right? So same with Ian McEwan. I mean, I think that's interesting, right? Because I think we have the same thing in France, and probably even here, right?
Thank you.
We have time for one more question, please.
Yeah, sure. I was just going to ask, this is going totally the other way. How much influence do you think writers like Jules Verne and H. Rider Haggard, and then even in the U.S., you know, Edgar Rice Burroughs, they all had these kind of stereotypical representations of particularly North Africa as a culture, and you know, did that setting of the tone.
Oh yeah, you name some of the great names. But again, I think the difference with them, and they're with Henty, right? Henty is sort of my stand-in for the whole group. The difference is that first, all these references are simply there for adventure, right? It's their vehicle for having a good time, for the pleasure, right? I know this is very sort of fuzzy thinking, but my take is that the vehicle then becomes the end itself. In other words, these representations, while disgraceful and racist and colonialist, at least with regard to Islam, they're not about the very character of Islam itself, right? There's this sort of stand-in Islamic character, and let's have some fun, write a good story, a novel. It sells, magazines and actually a lot of consumables. The one thing you should know is that basically the late 19th to early 20th century commodity economy had almost everything had some kind of Orientalist relationship. I'm a British football fan, and my team, now relegated to the conference, and Bristol Rovers, their original kit were called the Black Arab kit, referring to the Sudanese Mahdist Army. The Saracens are the Bristol, or a rugby team. So yeah, that's sort of my answer. I think that the writers, particularly Ryder Haggard you mentioned, it's not about the nature of Islam or the Prophet. I don't think it's yes, the slurs are there, but they're not intended in the same sort of sectarian sense. That's not to say that they're not offensive.
Thank you very much for your time, energy, and support. And I hope you will join us for further panels and tonight's keynote.